Nobody at Riverside General ever looked twice at Nurse Elena Cross. She was 53 years old, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a plain bun, reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and a spine slightly bent from decades of 12-hour shifts. She moved through the emergency room with the shuffle of a woman who had given her whole life to other people's pain, murmuring soft reassurances to frightened patients, refilling coffee for exhausted residents, and never once raising her voice. The younger nurses called her sweet old Elena, behind her back, sometimes with affection, sometimes with the faint condescension reserved for anyone who seems too gentle to matter. What none of them knew, what nobody in that hospital had ever been told, was that Elena Cross had another name once, a name whispered only in classified briefings and sealed personnel files. Petty Officer First Class Elena Cross, United States Navy, Sea, Air, and Land Teams, the first woman ever quietly attached to a Joint Special Operations Medical Unit. A ghost soldier who had pulled wounded men out of burning compounds in 3 countries the public had never heard of. That life was supposed to be over. She had traded a trident pin for a stethoscope, hoping the quiet halls of civilian medicine would let her finally rest. She was wrong. It started on a Tuesday night, the kind of shift where the waiting room overflowed and tempers ran thin. A group of 4 men stormed through the sliding doors, reeking of alcohol and rage, dragging a 5th man between them who was bleeding from a gash above his eye. They wanted him seen immediately, ahead of the line, and when the triage nurse calmly explained that patients were treated by severity, not by demand, the largest of the men, a mountain of muscle named Dez with knuckles wrapped in dirty tape, slammed his fist onto the counter hard enough to crack the laminate. Security was slow that night, short-staffed, and stretched thin across 3 other incidents. Elena stepped in exactly the way she always did, softly, hands raised, voice low, and even offering to personally examine the bleeding man herself if they would just lower their voices and step back from the desk. It was the kind of de-escalation she had performed 1,000 times, in hospitals and in war zones alike, though nobody watching that night could have guessed the second part. Dez didn't want de-escalation. He wanted a target, and the frail-looking nurse standing between him and what he wanted made an easy one. He shoved her, hard, and Elena's shoulder cracked against the metal door frame. Gasps rippled through the waiting room. 2 other nurses screamed for security. A resident physician froze mid-stride, clipboard falling from his hands. For one suspended second, everyone in that ER saw exactly what they expected to see. An old woman, stumbling, vulnerable, about to become a headline. Dez grinned and reached for her again, grabbing a fistful of her scrub top, hauling her up on her toes so her face was inches from his, growling something about respect and waiting your turn. His 3 friends closed in behind him, forming a wall of bodies between Elena and the rest of the room, cutting off every camera angle except the one mounted above the pharmacy window, the one nobody thought to check until much later. What happened in the next 4 seconds would be replayed on that hospital's internal security footage more times than any incident in its history. Elena's free hand, moved before her mind had to consciously decide anything, muscle memory built over 20 years of training taking over completely. Her palm found the pressure point at Dez's wrist, and with a small, almost lazy-looking twist, the enormous man's fingers sprang open on their own, releasing her scrub top as if it had suddenly caught fire. Before he could process what had happened, her other hand was already moving, a short, precise strike to the side of his knee that folded his leg like a broken hinge and dropped 240 pounds of angry muscle straight to the tile floor with a thud that silenced the entire waiting room. The 3 men behind him surged forward on instinct, and Elena Cross, 53 years old, silver hair still perfectly in place, turned to meet them with the calm, terrible efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing in far worse places, against far worse men, with far higher stakes than a rowdy Tuesday night in the ER. The second man swung a wild haymaker aimed at her jaw. She didn't dodge so much as simply wasn't there anymore, her body sliding half a step to the side while her elbow drove upward into his exposed ribs, and he folded around her arm with a wheeze that emptied his lungs entirely. The third man hesitated, and hesitation, Elena knew better than almost anyone alive, was the single most expensive mistake a person could make in a fight. She closed the distance instead of waiting, her forearm catching his wrist, redirecting his momentum past her, using his own weight to spin him face first into the reinforced glass of the reception window, which held, though his nose did not. Only the fourth man, the bleeding one they dragged in the first place, remained standing, staring at her with wide, sobering eyes, all the fight draining out of him as fast as the blood from his forehead. Security finally arrived, badges and radios crackling, only to find four grown men groaning on the floor and one silver-haired nurse calmly straightening her glasses, smoothing down her scrub top, and asking, in the exact same gentle voice she'd used all night, whether anyone needed her to look at that now. The waiting room stayed frozen in stunned silence for a long moment before the first phone came up, recording. Word moves fast in hospitals, faster than ambulances sometimes, and by the time the shift supervisor arrived to ask what on earth had happened, 3 different versions of the story were already spreading through the building, each one wilder than the last. Elena said nothing, filled out the standard incident report in her small, neat handwriting, and returned to her rounds as though nothing unusual had occurred at all, though her hands, for just a moment while she charted, trembled with something that wasn't fear. It was the particular ache of old instincts waking up after a long sleep, instincts she had buried under years of gentleness, hoping never to need them again. But somewhere across town, in a windowless office with 3 monitors and a secure line to a base she was never supposed to think about again, someone had just watched that same security footage roll in, and they were already reaching for the phone. Because Elena Cross wasn't only remembered by the Navy, she was still needed by it. And the timing of tonight's little display could not have been worse for the secret she had spent 5 years trying to keep buried. If you want to see exactly who's calling and why Elena's quiet life is about to be torn wide open, make sure you're subscribed because Chapter 2 is where the real mission begins. The phone call came at 3 in the morning, 20 minutes after Elena had finally collapsed on her couch, still wearing her scrubs. Ice pack pressed to the shoulder Des had slammed into the doorframe. She recognized the number before she even answered. A string of digits burned into her memory from a life she had tried to forget, and her stomach tightened the way it used to right before a briefing that meant somebody wasn't coming home. The voice on the other end belonged to Commander Ray Alvarez, her old handler, a man she hadn't spoken to since the day she signed her discharge papers and asked, quietly, to be left alone. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He told her that the footage from Riverside General had already crossed 3 deaths in the Pentagon by the time the sun came up, not because anyone cared about a bar fight in an ER, but because of who else had seen it. Buried in facial recognition sweeps run on hospital security systems nationwide, a flag had gone up on one of the 4 men Elena had taken down. His real name wasn't the one on his ID. He was a courier for a trafficking network the Navy and 3 federal agencies had been quietly hunting for 18 months. A network with a supply line that ran straight through a shipping port less than 40 miles from that hospital, and straight through a woman Elena had once called a friend and a fellow operator, who had vanished without explanation during their last deployment together and was now, according to fresh intelligence, alive, and possibly not on the right side of this anymore. Alvarez didn't ask her to come back exactly, not in so many words, because officially, Elena Cross did not exist in any capacity the Navy could admit to. What he asked instead was whether she would be willing to have one conversation, off the books, with a small team already converging on that same trafficking network from 3 different angles, none of whom had her particular set of skills, none of whom had ever operated a hospital floor as smoothly as she had operated a battlefield. Elena sat in the dark of her small apartment for a long moment, staring at the ice pack melting in her lap, feeling the old pull she thought she'd surgically removed from herself years ago, the pull of being needed for something larger than restocking gauze and calming frightened families. She thought about her patients, about the quiet satisfaction of a life spent healing instead of hunting. Then she thought about the missing operator, a woman named Jules Ferreira who had once carried Elena on her back for 6 miles through hostile terrain with a bullet in her calf. And Elena knew, the way she always knew things that mattered, that she was already saying yes before Alvarez had finished the sentence. The next 72 hours moved with the strange dual rhythm of two entirely different lives running in parallel. By day, Elena clocked into Riverside General exactly on schedule, her shoulder bruised but bandaged, absorbing the whispered awe of colleagues who now looked at her with a mixture of fear and fascination, treating patients with the same soft patience as always, letting everyone believe the fight had been a fluke, an adrenaline surge, an old self-defense class remembered at just the right moment. By night, she met Alvarez and a three-person joint task force team in the back room of a shuttered dive bar near the port, poring over shipping manifests and surveillance photos, her old training resurfacing with unsettling ease as she identified patterns in the courier's movements that the team's analyst had missed entirely, patterns only someone who had once run supply routes through hostile territory herself would recognize. She discovered that the courier, the man she dropped in the ER, had been due to make a handoff at the hospital that very night, using the chaos of a manufactured bar fight as cover, and that Elena's intervention, meant only to protect frightened patients, had accidentally blown apart a carefully planned exchange, forcing the network to accelerate a much larger shipment scheduled for 3 nights later at the port itself. That third night, Elena Cross stood at the edge of a container yard in a black tactical vest pulled over what used to be her scrub top, night vision goggles pushed up on her forehead, listening to Alvarez's voice crackle through a comm unit tucked into her ear for the first time in 5 years. The team moved into position around the yard, shadows within shadows, while Elena took the lead on the medical extraction team, ready to move the moment shots were fired because in every mission she had ever run, someone always ended up bleeding, and someone always needed her hand steady enough to save them. When Jules Ferreira finally stepped out from behind a stack of shipping containers, weapon raised, eyes hollow with 5 years of whatever had happened to her after she vanished, Elena didn't reach for a weapon of her own. She lowered her goggles, raised her empty hands, and spoke her old friend's name into the dark with the same gentle steadiness she used on every frightened patient who had ever come through her ER doors, the voice that had talked down grieving families and panicking gunshot victims, and now, impossibly, an old friend standing on the wrong side of a smuggling operation with a gun trained on her chest. What passed between them in the next 60 seconds would never appear in any official report, because some truths are too complicated for paperwork. But it ended with Jules lowering her weapon, sobbing, and finally telling Elena the truth about the 5 years she'd been presumed dead, about the people who had used her, threatened her family, and forced her into the network she now desperately wanted out of. The raid that followed dismantled the trafficking route entirely. 3 arrests made, 2 shipments seized, and 1 soldier quietly brought back from the darkness by the one person who never stopped believing she was still worth saving. When Elena returned to Riverside General the following week, nobody there would ever know the full story, only that their soft-spoken, silver-haired nurse had somehow vanished for a few days and returned looking, impossibly, even calmer than before, as though some old weight had finally been set down. She went back to her rounds, her coffee refills, her gentle voice in loud, frightened rooms, carrying 2 lives inside one small, unassuming frame, exactly as she always had. If this story moved you, if you believe the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest, most extraordinary histories, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like Elena's, the hidden heroes walking among us disguised as ordinary people, are exactly what this channel is built to tell, and there are many more waiting for you.